Lord, I have stopped asking. If you still have something for me, you will have to bring it yourself. A man who would search for a lost hound himself, who would not pass a woman alone on the road, and who would stay after the dog was found.
She had just finished telling God she had stopped asking for a companion, listing the exact 3 tests any man would have to pass. And now the animal that belonged to the Duke of Ellersby had chosen her side in the dark. Lady Day was 3 weeks away, the new tenant had been named, and every column in her ledger still balanced while the roof was being taken from under her. She laid one hand on the closed Bible, the other on the dog that would not move, and heard a man's voice on the lane calling a name that belonged to the Duke of Ellersby. He had come looking for the hound, but he found the woman the hall had already decided to erase. Before we start, let me know where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, South Africa, and even the United Kingdom. So let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Let's begin the story. The lane ran north from the Dowager cottage for nearly a mile before it met the turnpike, and Hester Langley had walked it alone every evening for 11 months. The surface was still soft from the last of the March rains. Her boots left clear prints in the mud that would harden by morning. She carried the black Morocco family Bible under her right arm, the gilt cross on the cover catching what little light remained. The ribbon markers hung down against her cloak. She had made the same walk in every weather since the parish clerk's funeral, and she no longer counted the days. The deerhound found her just as the light began to fail. It came out of the blackthorn hedge without sound and pressed its great head against her skirts as though it had been looking for her all its life. Hester stopped. She laid one gloved hand on the animal's shoulder and felt the fine tremor of a creature that had run hard. The hound did not bark. It simply stayed, leaning its weight against her, and would not be moved by soft words or by the quiet push of her hand. She had walked this lane for 11 months without company. Now a dog larger than most farmyard curs had chosen her side and would not leave it. The evening wind carried the smell of wet earth and the distant wood smoke from the hall chimneys. Somewhere behind the bend, a man's voice called a name she did not know. The hound's ears flicked once, but it did not turn. It kept its head against her cloak, as if the decision had already been made. Hester stood still a moment longer, then continued toward the cottage. The animal matched her step for step. She did not look back. She only adjusted the Bible under her arm so that the worn spine rested more securely against her side, and she walked on. By the time the church clock struck 5 the next morning, Hester was already at the deal table in the cottage kitchen, with the household ledger open before her. The single candle she had lit threw a steady circle of light across the ruled pages. She worked in a plain gray gown and a clean white apron, her hair pinned tightly under a cap that had once been finer. The Bible sat closed at the far edge of the same table, its black cover still damp at the corners from the evening walk. She never put the 2 books away from each other. The accounts required the same careful hand as the verses she sometimes copied into the blank leaves at the back. She had balanced the cottage accounts every quarter since her husband's death. The figures were small: rent for the 2 pasture closes, the cost of coal and candles, the wages of the girl who came 3 days a week from the village. But she kept them, as if the whole estate turned on the accuracy of her pen. 3 shillings and 4pence for the farrier, £1.12 for the winter's peat, a single entry in a neat column for the packet of willow bark she had purchased for the fever that had taken 2 cottagers the previous month. She wrote the total at the foot of the page and sanded the ink. Then she closed the ledger and laid her palm for a moment on the Bible's cover before rising. Mrs. Croft came in from the still room with a tray of clean bottles. The older woman set them down without speaking and glanced at the 2 books side by side. "You were out late again," she said. "The lane is quiet after 4, Hester answered. "I like the quiet." Mrs. Croft wiped her hands on her apron. "There was a letter this morning. From the hall. The boy left it on the settle." Hester did not reach for it at once. She finished rinsing the ink from her pen and set it to dry. Only then did she take the sealed paper. The wax bore the Ellersby crest, small and clear. She broke it with her thumbnail and read the contents once, then a second time more slowly. The Dowager Duchess wrote in a fine, unhurried hand. The cottage would be required after Lady Day. A suitable tenant had already been spoken of. Mrs. Langley was of course welcome to remain until the quarter, but arrangements should be made for her removal. The tone was civil. It was also final. Hester folded the letter and set it beside the ledger. She looked at the figures she had just balanced, and at the black cover of the Bible. Her father's voice came back to her as clearly as if he still sat in the chair by the hearth. A woman who keeps honest figures has already kept half her faith. She had kept the figures. She had kept the faith as she understood it. Neither had been enough to hold the roof. She stood and went to the still room. The shelves held the neat rows of dried feverfew, the pots of salve, the small bottles of tincture she had made herself through the winter. She checked the levels out of habit, then returned to the kitchen and put the letter away in the drawer where she kept the rent receipts. Mrs. Croft watched her but said nothing further. The older woman only reached out and moved the Bible a fraction closer to the ledger, as if the two objects might steady each other. That evening Hester walked the lane again. The sky was clearer than the night before. A thin edge of light still clung to the western hills. She carried the Bible under her arm as always. The deerhound was not there. She had half expected it, and was surprised by the small disappointment when the hedge remained empty. She walked farther than usual, past the place where the blackthorn gave way to open pasture. The wind had dropped. She could hear the distant sound of water in the ditch that ran beside the track. When she reached the low stone bridge, she stopped. There was no one in sight. The fields lay quiet under the fading light. She set the Bible on the parapet and rested both hands on the worn stone. For a long time she said nothing. Then she spoke aloud, the way a woman might speak when she believes the only listener is the road itself. Lord, I have stopped asking. I stopped last autumn when the second letter came, and I knew there would be no third. I stopped when the cottage account still balanced and the roof still leaked and the hall still wrote as if I were a line to be crossed out. If you still have something for me, you will have to bring it yourself. A man who would search for a lost hound himself. A man who would not pass a woman alone on the road. A man who would stay after the dog was found. That is all. I will not ask again. She waited. The ditch water moved under the bridge. A late thrush called once from the far hedge and then fell silent. Nothing else answered. Hester picked up the Bible, settled it again under her arm, and turned back toward the cottage. She had gone no more than 20 paces when she heard the soft pad of heavy paws on the wet track behind her. The deerhound came out of the dusk and pressed itself against her skirts exactly as it had the evening before. This time it was breathing harder. Mud clung to its legs and a thin scratch ran along one shoulder. Hester stopped and laid her hand on the animal's neck. The hound leaned into her with the same steady weight. A man's boot sounded on the gravel a short distance back along the lane. The hound's ears moved, but it did not leave her side. Hester kept her hand on the dog and waited. Begin narration. Batch 4. The rain continued through the second day without easing. By mid-morning the lane had become a narrow run of brown water between the hedges, and the yardstones shone with a constant film of wet. Hester kept the cottage door open for the light and worked at the deal table with the ledger open and the Bible closed beside it. The deerhound lay across the threshold, head on its paws, watching the gate as though it expected the same man who had come the day before. He arrived just after the church clock struck 10, coat darker from the rain, hat once more in his hand rather than on his head. He did not knock. He simply stood at the gate until she saw him and nodded. The hound rose and went to him, then returned at once to Hester's side. He took the rebuff without comment and waited until she stepped out under the eaves. The shoulder is clean, she said. The salve has done its work. He looked at the animal and then at the open kitchen behind her, where the two books sat together under the gray daylight. I am glad of it. May I ask the name of the cottage? I have been away from the county longer than I care to count. Langley, she answered. It has been Langley since my husband's father held the clerk's place. He repeated the name once, quietly, as though fitting it against something he already knew. Then he asked whether the roof had held through the night's rain. When she said it had, he nodded and offered to walk the boundary of the two pasture closes with her, to see whether the ditch needed clearing before the water rose further. She considered the offer only a moment. The accounts would wait. The land would not. They walked the wet fields in silence for the better part of an hour. The man worked with his own hands, dragging the heavier stones aside so the ditch could run free. He asked nothing of her beyond the direction of the water and the places where the banks had given way in other years. When they returned to the cottage, the knees of his boots were thick with mud, and his sleeves were turned back to the forearm. Mrs. Croft met them at the door with dry cloths and said nothing about the state of the gentleman's clothes. It was Mrs. Croft who first nearly spoke the truth. While the man stood in the yard rinsing his hands at the rain barrel, the older woman drew Hester into the still room and shut the door. "I knew the face," she said in a low voice. "Not the name he is using, but the face. There is an Ellersby look that does not change with the years. My sister served at the hall when the old Duke was alive. That is the younger son's son, or I have lost my eyes." Hester looked through the small window at the man still bent over the barrel. "He has given no name beyond the one the Hound answers to." "And you will not ask it," Mrs. Croft said. It was not a question. "Best you do not. The Dowager has already named the quarter day for this roof. If that is who walks your fields in the rain, the hall will not thank either of us for noticing." Hester returned to the kitchen without answering. She found the man drying his hands on the cloth Mrs. Croft had left. He glanced once at the ledger and the Bible still side by side on the table, then at her face. "You have had word from the hall," he said. "A letter," she answered. "The cottage is required after Lady Day. A tenant has been spoken of." He was silent for a time. Rain continued to fall beyond the open door. At last he said, "Lady Day is 3 weeks off. That is not long." "It is long enough to balance the final accounts," Hester said, "and to decide where the books will travel next." He looked at her as though measuring the weight of the words. Then he settled his hat under his arm and took his leave, saying only that he would return if the ditch needed further work. The deerhound watched him go down the muddy path and did not follow. 2 days later the rain eased, but the Dowager herself came in its place. The carriage stopped at the gate in the late afternoon. Lady Margaret Ellersby stepped down in a dark traveling cloak and walked the short path without waiting for the footman. Mrs. Croft opened the door and stood aside. Hester remained at the table, the ledger open, the Bible closed beside it. The Dowager's eyes moved once over the 2 books in the plain room. "Mrs. Langley, I trust the letter was clear." "It was clear, my lady. Lady Day falls on the 25th. The new tenant requires possession. You will of course receive the usual notice money, but the cottage cannot remain in present hands beyond that date." She paused. "There has been talk of a stranger walking the closes. The hall prefers its business kept quiet. I trust you understand." Hester met the older woman's gaze without rising. "I understand the quarter day, my lady. The accounts will be ready." The Dowager inclined her head a fraction and left as she had come. The carriage turned back toward the hall. Hester closed the ledger carefully and laid her hand for a moment on the black cover of the Bible. Mrs. Croft stood in the doorway and said nothing. The deerhound rose and pressed its head against Hester's knee, as though the weight of the visit had been its own. That night the wind rose again, and the rain returned harder than before. Near midnight, a boy from the village came hammering at the gate. His father's fever had worsened. The willow bark they had was nearly gone. Hester lit a second candle, opened the still room, and measured what remained. There was enough for 1 strong dose, and no more. The nearest further supply lay at the apothecary in the market town, 6 miles off by the turnpike in the wet dark. She did not hesitate long. She closed the Bible, laid her palm flat on the cover for a single second, then took her cloak and the small lantern. Mrs. Croft tried to stop her at the door. "You cannot walk that road alone in this weather." "The boy cannot walk it either," Hester said, "and the fever will not wait for daylight." She left the cottage with the lantern and the remaining packet of bark wrapped in oilcloth. The deerhound forced its way out behind her and would not be turned back. The lane was a river of mud. Wind drove the rain sideways against her face. She walked steadily, the lantern swinging low, the hound a dark shape at her side. Twice the light nearly went out. Twice she shielded it with her cloak and kept moving. She did not know that the man she had not yet named had seen the lantern from the upper windows of the hall and had come down the north road after her. He caught up near the low stone bridge, coat already soaked, horse left behind because the ground was too uncertain. He did not try to take the lantern from her hand. He only matched her pace and said, "The apothecary will not thank either of us for the hour, but the door will open." They reached the town together. The dose was obtained. On the return the rain lessened, but the mud remained. When they came in sight of the cottage gate, the man stopped. "You did not have to go yourself," he said. "The bark would not have walked," she answered, "and I have kept worse watches." He looked at her for a long moment in the thin light of the lantern. Then he said, almost to himself, 3 weeks, Lady Day. He did not explain the words. He only waited until she and the hound were safely inside the yard, before turning back toward the hall in the dark. Inside the kitchen, Hester set the new packet of willow bark on the shelf, and returned the Bible to its place beside the ledger. She did not undress at once. She sat at the table with one hand resting on the closed black cover, and listened to the rain ease against the windows. Somewhere in the dark, the man who had walked the 6 miles beside her was making his own way home. She did not know his full name. She only knew that he had searched for the hound himself, that he had not passed her on the road, and that he had stayed after the dog was found. The third test had been met in the wet dark without either of them speaking it aloud. She opened the ledger to a clean page and wrote the date. Then she closed both books and went to bed, with the deerhound stretched across the threshold of her room. Begin narration. Batch 5. The morning after the night walk dawned clear and cold. Hester rose before the church clock struck 6, banked the kitchen fire, and set the ledger and the Bible once more side by side on the deal table. The deerhound was already at the door. She let the animal out into the yard and stood for a moment watching the north lane, empty now under a thin wash of early light. The mud from the night before had begun to crust. There was no sign of the man who had walked the 6 miles beside her in the rain. "I want to stop here for just a moment, because I have been thinking about what Hester did when the boy came hammering at the gate in the dark, and I wonder if you have been thinking about it too. She had the last of the willow bark, the fever would not wait, and the road was 6 miles of mud and wind." She laid her hand on the closed Bible for 1 second. Then she took the lantern and she went. "That is not weakness, friend. That is the hardest kind of courage there is. The courage to do the next right thing when the prayer you once spoke still feels unanswered. You are not children. Most of you have buried someone. Most of you have prayed a prayer you were not certain was heard. Some of you are sitting in a quiet house right now with this story keeping you company, and I do not take that lightly. Take 1 second and subscribe before you go any further, and leave a word in the comments telling me where in this wide world you are listening from. I read every one of them. It is how I know who I am talking to out here in the dark. Now come back, because the clear morning did not last, and the truth that had been walking the north lane in plain clothes was about to step into the light, whether anyone was ready for it or not. Mrs. Croft returned from the village just before noon with a basket of eggs and a face set like stone. She set the basket down, closed the kitchen door, and spoke without preamble. "They know at the hall," she said. "The footman who drives the Dowager saw him on the turnpike last night in the rain. He was not alone. Word has already reached the housekeeper. They are saying the Duke of Ellersby has been walking the closes for near a week in a coat any steward might wear, and that the Langley widow has had the keeping of his hound." Hester stood very still beside the table. The ledger was open to the morning's page. The Bible lay closed at its edge. She looked at neither. "The Duke," she said. "The same. Absent 7 years and more, and now returned without notice. The Dowager is not pleased. There is talk of the quarter-day being brought forward if the cottage has become a place of convenience." Hester closed the ledger with care. She did not raise her voice. He gave no title. He asked the name of the cottage and the state of the ditch. That is all. "It is enough," Mrs. Croft said. "Enough for the hall to decide the roof is no longer yours to keep." Hester said nothing further. She took her cloak and the Bible and went out into the yard. The deerhound rose to follow. She walked the length of the north lane as far as the low stone bridge, and stood there with the black book under her arm, looking at the water that still ran high from the recent rain. She did not pray. She only stood until the cold had settled into her hands. Then she turned back. He came that same afternoon. She saw him at the gate while the light was still good. He wore the same plain coat. The only change was the set of his shoulders, as though he already knew the words that would meet him. She opened the gate but did not step aside to let him in. "You are the Duke of Ellersby," she said. He did not deny it. "I am. I should have spoken the title on the first evening. I did not. You let me believe otherwise." "I let the hound choose first," he said, "and I let the work of the ditch and the night road speak before any name I carry. That was pride, not strategy. I see it now. Hester held the Bible against her side. Lady Day is still the date named. The Dowager has made the terms plain. I will not be the cause of further talk at the hall. The talk is already made, he answered. I will not allow it to cost you the roof. You cannot prevent it by standing at my gate. She met his eyes. I asked for a man who would search for his own hound, who would not pass a woman alone on the road, and who would stay after the dog was found. You met those measures. I did not ask for a duke who keeps his rank in his pocket until the village has already named him. The gap is too wide. I will not cross it. She stepped back and closed the gate between them. The deerhound stood for a long moment looking from one to the other, then followed her into the yard. The Duke of Ellersby remained on the lane side of the gate until the cottage door had shut. Only then did he turn and walk back toward the hall. That night, Hester sat alone at the deal table long after Mrs. Croft had gone to her bed. The ledger stayed closed. The Bible stayed closed. She did not open either. She only rested both hands on the worn black cover and spoke into the quiet kitchen the question she had not allowed herself on the bridge. I stopped asking, she said. You brought the dog and the man who walked the dark road. Was any of it heard, or was I only keeping accounts with empty columns? No answer came. The fire settled in the grate. The deerhound sighed once in its sleep across the threshold. Hester remained where she was until the candle burned low. Then she rose and went to her room without lighting another. Across the park, in a study that had stood unused for 7 years, Rafe Ellersby sat with a single candle of his own. He had not changed out of the plain coat. The desk before him held no ledgers of the estate. It held only a small book of common prayer taken from the chapel shelf an hour earlier. He turned the pages without reading them and spoke the only words he had managed since the gate closed. I stopped asking to be forgiven the balance, he said to the empty room. I told her that much. I did not tell her I had also stopped asking whether a man who has kept his own counsel this long is permitted to ask for anything else. He closed the prayer book and set it aside. The candle burned on. Somewhere in the house a clock struck 1. He did not move. Near dawn, a single folded paper was pushed under the cottage door. Mrs. Croft found it when she came down to bank the fire. It carried no seal and no signature, only 4 lines in a plain hand. The ditch is clear. The bark reached the boy in time. The hound knew first. Lady Day need not be the end of the accounts. Hester read the lines once by the new light at the window. She did not smile. She only set the paper on the table between the ledger and the Bible, then opened the black book to the place the ribbon had marked for 11 months, and left it open while she began the morning's figures. Begin narration. Batch 6. Hester worked the morning's figures with the Bible open beside the ledger, and the unsigned paper lying between them. She did not set the paper aside. She only kept it in view while she entered the last of the peat costs and the notice money the Dowager's letter had promised. The columns balanced. She sanded the ink, closed the ledger, and left the black book open to the place the ribbon had marked for 11 months. Mrs. Croft came in from the yard with the news before the church clock struck 9. The Duke of Ellersby had ridden to the hall at first light and had not left the Dowager's sitting room for nearly an hour. When the door finally opened, Lady Margaret had ordered the carriage for the afternoon and had sent word that the new tenant's arrival was to be delayed until further notice. No explanation was given to the housekeeper. None was required. The change in the quarter-day arrangement was already known below stairs by the time Mrs. Croft returned. Hester heard the report without comment. She only rested her hand for a moment on the open page of the Bible, then rose and went about the morning's work. The deerhound stayed close to her heels. He came to the gate at midday. This time he wore no plain coat. The dark riding dress was simple still, but the cut and the quiet authority in the way he stood made the rank plain even before he spoke. He did not wait for her to open the gate. He waited until she stepped into the yard, and then he spoke, where Mrs. Croft could hear every word from the kitchen doorway. I told my mother the truth of the last week, he said. I told her I had searched for the hound myself, that I had walked the ditch and the night road, and that I had found the only accounts in the county that still balance with a Bible kept open beside them. She has withdrawn the tenant. Lady Day no longer holds against this roof. Hester stood with the black book still in her hands. You cannot buy the cottage's peace with a single conversation. I did not buy it, he answered. I disclosed what I had kept hidden. She saw the same measure the hound saw. That is all. He looked at the open Bible, then at her face. "You quoted me a line once about ledgers and balances. I said God keeps them like any steward, and that I had stopped asking to be forgiven the sum. I was wrong in the stopping. The first book of Samuel still stands. The Lord looks on the heart. I have spent 7 years pretending the column was closed. It was not." Hester held the book a little more firmly. The deerhound pressed against her skirts. Mrs. Croft remained in the doorway, a quiet witness. "I asked for a man who would search for a lost hound himself," Hester said, the words steady and plain. "One who would not pass a woman alone on the road. One who would stay after the dog was found. I told the Lord I had stopped asking, and that if he still had something for me, he would have to bring it himself. You were brought. The tests were met. I will not pretend otherwise." She drew a breath. The crisis that had waited since the letter first arrived now stood in the open yard between them. "We have done what we know how to do," she said, speaking aloud now so that the words carried past the gate and into the lane. "The accounts are balanced. The notice money is set aside. The ditch is clear. The bark reached the boy. The truth has been spoken at the hall. We cannot force a roof to remain, if the will behind it has not changed, and we cannot force a heart that has kept its own counsel for 7 years to open. If it is your will that this place and this life continue together, you will have to settle the rest. I am asking." She did not lower the Bible. She simply stood with it open in her hands and waited. Rafe Ellersby stepped through the gate. He did not take the book from her. He only placed his own hand over the open page, covering the ribbon and the printed words together, and spoke the answer that had been forming since the first evening on the lane. "I am that man," he said. "I searched. I did not pass you by. I stayed. And I am asking now, in the hearing of the woman who has kept this house, and the hound that chose it first, whether you will have me as I am. Title, ledger, and the long balance I can no longer carry alone." Hester looked down at their hands resting together on the open page. She looked at Mrs. Croft, who only nodded once. Then she closed the Bible, keeping his hand beneath hers for a moment longer, and gave the only answer the 11 months of walking the lane had prepared. Yes. The word was quiet. It was also final. The days that followed were not hurried. There was no large gathering and no announcement beyond the parish. On a clear morning 2 weeks before the Old Lady Day date, Hester Langley and Rafe Ellersby were married in the small church at the foot of the park. Mrs. Croft stood as witness. The deerhound waited outside the porch and followed them home along the same north lane that had first brought them together. The Dowager did not attend the service, but she sent the cottage keys by the footman with a brief note that the roof was to remain in present hands for as long as those hands required it. No further explanation was offered. None was needed. They kept the dower cottage for the first months. The ledger and the Bible stayed on the deal table. The columns continued to balance. In the evenings, Hester sometimes read aloud from the open page while the fire settled and the hound stretched across the hearth. Rafe listened without interruption. Once, when the reading reached the words she had once claimed and then set aside, he said only, "Delight thyself also in the Lord. He has given more than I knew how to ask." She did not answer with a sermon. She only turned the page and kept reading. In time, they moved between the cottage and the hall as the season required. The accounts of the larger estate came under her hand by degrees. She kept them with the same care she had given the peat and the notice money. The Bible traveled with the ledgers. On the mornings when the work was heaviest, she still set the 2 books side by side before she began. The habit had never been only about the figures. One evening in early summer, they walked the north lane together after the light had begun to fade. The deerhound ranged a little ahead, then returned to walk between them. The mud of March was long gone. The hedges were thick with leaf. Hester carried no Bible that evening. It remained on the table at home, open to the place the ribbon still marked. She did not need the weight of it under her arm to remember the words she had spoken when she believed herself alone. Rafe stopped at the low stone bridge and looked back toward the cottage roof, visible now beyond the blackthorn. "You stopped asking," he said. "I did." And he brought it anyway. He did. They stood a little longer while the thrush called from the far hedge and the water moved quietly under the bridge. Then they turned home together, the hound at their side, the lane stretching behind them in the last of the light. Begin narration. Batch 7. 2 years and 3 months after the morning they turned home along the north lane, The Dower cottage still held its place at the edge of the park. The roof had been mended once in the second autumn and did not leak. The deal table in the kitchen remained the center of the ordinary days. On it, the household ledger and the black Morocco Bible sat side by side exactly as they had done when the accounts were small and the future uncertain. The columns were longer now. They still balanced. Hester Ellersby kept the figures in the same clear hand. She no longer walked the lane every evening, yet she walked it often enough that the deerhound, older and slower, still rose when she took her cloak. The animal had never returned to the hall kennels. It slept across thresholds and followed at its own pace, as though the first choice made in the March dusk had never needed revision. Rafe had not spoken again of the 7 years he had kept apart. The prayer book he had opened that night in the unused study remained on a shelf in the cottage rather than in the larger house. Sometimes in the evening he read from it while she finished the last of the day's entries. Neither of them treated the habit as remarkable. It was simply what the household did when the light began to go. On a quiet afternoon in the third spring, she opened the Bible to the place the ribbon had marked since the first year of her widowhood. The words were the same: "Delight thyself also in the Lord, and he shall give thee the desires of thine heart." Once the verse had sat on the page like an unpaid balance, a claim she had stopped pressing. Now it read as a record of what had already been entered. The desire she had ceased to name had been brought down the lane by a hound and a man in a plain coat. The roof remained. The table remained. The name she carried had been enlarged without erasing the one she had kept through the hard months. She closed the book gently and set it back beside the ledger. The lane outside was green again. The thrush still called from the far hedge when the light was right. Hester stood for a moment with one hand resting on the two covers and looked toward the window. It was enough, she said. It was more than enough. She had stopped asking. The answer had come anyway, on its own feet, and had stayed. A woman who had buried one life and balanced every farthing of the next had finally closed the book on the long season of waiting. A man who had kept his own counsel and his own ledger for 7 years had learned that some balances are not settled by silence. Between them, the ordinary days continued. The roof sound, the table ordered, the hound at the hearth, and the verse that once felt like a debt now read like a receipt. Delight thyself also in the Lord. He gives more than the heart knows how to request, and he gives it in the shape of a lane, a dog that will not leave, and a hand willing to stay after the searching is done. That truth is not reserved for one cottage in Derbyshire. It reaches as far as the place where you are listening now. Wherever you are in this wide world, whatever door you are standing in front of, whatever prayer you have stopped speaking because the answer felt too long delayed, I am grateful you are here. The story is not only theirs. It is the long record of a God who still brings what is needed down ordinary roads. Keep asking, keep working, keep believing.
Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you enjoy clean stories of faith, survival, and restoration, hit the subscribe button because we have so many more coming for you. Listen to our stories and you'll see prayers get answered, faith springing to courage and action. You'll see miracles happen for the people who believe and trust in God. Do check our other amazing videos. See you in the next one.